These past 2 years have been challenging in many ways. And today I'd like to focus on a challenge which in the grand scheme of things may seem insignificant. For some of us who have chosen to gather in community to celebrate the mystery of the love we call God around Word and Sacrament, the challenge of participating in the sacraments has brought with it some interesting revelations. Now, technology helped us with the word part of worship. Indeed, congregations all over the planet have managed in various ways to traverse the steep learning curve of technology, which has empowered them to proclaim the word in worship in new and innovative ways. And while 2 years of worshiping primarily online has provided some interesting revelations about the way in which we experience the word in worship, I'd like us to turn our attention both here in the room, in this sanctuary, and indeed out there online, to some of the disturbing revelations about the sacrament of the Eucharist which have come to light after 2 long years of abstaining from the Eucharist. Now, I say abstaining because for 2 years, during which we were only able to worship in person for a brief period last fall, we did not celebrate communion. Even when we returned to in-person gatherings back on March 20th, we didn't resume the celebration until just 3 weeks ago on Easter Sunday. So in 2 years, we here at Holy Cross have only celebrated communion twice. Now, speaking only for myself, I have to confess that while I desperately missed gathering here in person to worship with you in the flesh, I confess that I really didn't miss celebrating communion. I know that many worship leaders made different decisions during lockdown and discovered various ways to celebrate communion over the internet. And while we briefly considered those little individual packages that were created with those plastic sealed containers with a sip of wine and a thin wafer wedged into these containers, the idea of all that packaging left so much to be desired. And yes, I have absolutely no difficulty understanding that the Spirit is not bound to the physicality of our sanctuaries. And indeed, the Spirit can work wonders over the internet. I must confess that I just wasn't feeling the need to give it a try. It wasn't until Easter Sunday and the challenges of celebrating communion safely with the COVID protocols in place that my own faith in the power of communion was severely challenged. So as word reached me this week that several of our members were testing positive for COVID, even though I know that they were infected elsewhere and that over time we are all going to be infected with Omicron, I had to ask myself, and eventually our worship team, should we continue to take the risk of celebrating communion? It wasn't until I allowed myself to actually listen and hear the words repeated in the anonymous gospel storyteller's story of Jesus celebrating breakfast with some of his followers. Writing some 70 years after the life of Jesus, our gospel storyteller sets a scene in which Jesus repeats words which speak to me, challenging me to actually taste and see the goodness of the love which we call God. When speaking to Peter, You remember Peter, the friend of Jesus, who, when push came to shove, when it really mattered, Peter is the one who betrayed Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And Jesus sits Peter down by the lake, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Jesus asks Peter, and in a way puts Peter in his place. In my sacred imagination, I can see the 2 friends sitting on the lakeshore, and I like to think that Jesus invited the friend he called his rock to sit upon a rock and ask not once, not twice, but 3 times, Peter, I thought you were my rock. But all things considered, Peter, I have to ask you, do you love me? I can see Peter visibly shrivel and shrink, remembering what he did or didn't do or say. Yes, Rabbi, you know I am your friend. It is Jesus' response which speaks to me now. Then feed my lambs. In my sacred imagination, I'm right there, sitting on a rock adjacent to these 2 blokes. And I am shriveling and I am shrinking along with Peter when Jesus asks again, do you love me? I hear the words, care for my sheep. And again I hear Jesus insist, feed my sheep. Yes, I know it's my imagination speaking to me. And yes, I know that I've entered the realm of metaphor. You are neither lambs nor sheep. And I'm certainly not Peter. And all the New Testament scholars I love and respect insist that the historical Jesus didn't actually say these words. But like Peter, I have all sorts of reasons for denying Jesus. Not the least of which is the fact that this worldwide pandemic ain't over just yet. And we together, we have a duty of care, and feeding people remains a risky endeavor. So on Friday, when I met with the worship team and we talked about the challenges of safely celebrating communion, it was a good conversation. A conversation in which I learned that I'm not alone in wondering why. So we tweaked our protocols, and I was encouraged to consider celebrating communion in one kind, that is to say, distributing the bread but not the wine, because passing wine around brings with it many more safety challenges, and after all, breaking bread together ought to be enough for us to experience the visible, tangible means of God's grace. So we decided loosely that we would remind one another that the word companionship comes from the French pan for bread, com, with. So companions are those people who break bread with one another. And I confess that I was prepared to do just that. But in my sacred imagination, I kept hearing Jesus say, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. I thought he was done, and then he went on and on and on and on again until finally I crumbled. As the solid rock of my avoidance crumbled, I finally began to see what I didn't want to be revealed. So let me confess to you, my beloved community, both here in this room and online. The truth is, of all the things that I have missed in the past 2 years, communion didn't even make the list. Once the truth was revealed to me, after I dried my tears, I had to ask myself, why? Why haven't I missed communion? Over the course of my life in the church, the sacrament of communion has fed and nourished me in ways that I can't even begin to count. Yes, my understanding of the sacraments has changed over the years, Long gone are notions of communion as a somber, penitential act of remembering Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. And over the years, I came to understand our Lutheran theology about celebrating the sacrament as a visible, tangible means of God's grace. Not a blood sacrifice, but a celebration of the gifts of bread and wine with the understanding that the divine mystery works in, with, through, and under the visible and tangible elements so that we can taste and see that our God is good. And over the decades of celebrating the Eucharist, which literally means thanksgiving, I have been nourished, grounded, and sustained by the companionship created over this meal. Yes, as my theology changed and I gave up the notion that Jesus was a human sacrifice for sin, rejected the idea that humans were once perfect and fell from grace, and indeed fixed my gaze beyond the notion of a personified deity, the words of the sacrament challenged me to find new ways to express our place in the cosmos. The reality of the divine mystery responsible for setting the cosmos into being, juxtaposed with a little piece of bread and a tiny taste of wine, did indeed challenge my sacred imagination as I struggled to enter ancient metaphors so that I could taste and see the mystery which is beyond the beyond and beyond that also, and that this mystery is indeed good. Let's just say our little ritual communions began to feel all too puny a celebration to carry the magnitude of the mystery. The last 2 weeks of trying to celebrate communion with COVID protocols have left me hungry for a better way to taste and see that the mystery is indeed good. So with Jesus' words ringing in my sacred imagination, I did what I usually do when I'm faced with a problem which I cannot resolve. I tried to read my way out of the reality that I haven't missed communion at all. Surely I'm not the only one who is struggling with communion. Surely somebody wiser than I am has seen something which I cannot see. So I scoured my bookshelves until I came upon a book which actually arrived a month before COVID did, before our first lockdown. And it reminded me that I've been struggling with the metaphor of communion for a long time. But at the time that this book arrived, communion was the last thing on my mind. We had bigger problems to unravel. This book is entitled Subversive Meals, an analysis of the Lord's Supper under Roman domination during the first century by R. Allen Street. Now, it sounds really very dry, but Jesus kept going on and on in my head, so for the love of Jesus, I began to read, if only to drown out my own doubts, screaming in my head in the guise of Jesus. I reminded myself that those first century followers of Jesus had so much more to worry about, and they managed to be nourished by the Lord's Supper. I might as well learn how they fed one another. Well, right here, on the very first page, in the very first sentence, I was hooked when I read this. The Lord's Supper of the first century was an anti-imperial praxis. Whenever early Christians met for a communal meal, they saw themselves as participating in a subversive, nonviolent act against the Roman Empire. What? Holy Communion, the Eucharist, as a subversive, nonviolent act against the Roman Empire? Well, let me tell you, I devoured this book in the last few days, and it has fed me, even as it has created a hunger in me for more. Pass the bread. More wine, please. And while you're at it, send some fish my way. I'm starving. Starving, I say. I'm famished for that old-time religion. But don't give me any of your comfort food. Just some basic bread, wine, and if you happen to have it, some fish would be fine. Those first century followers of the way, they certainly knew how to throw a supper. Not even our church potlucks come close to the resistance they served up back in the day. Do me a favor, open up your historical imaginations and travel back in time with me to the first century. We only have time for a brief visit, but trust me, we will be going back for more and more in the weeks ahead. So here we are. Let's say at the end of the first century. Jesus was executed by the state as a criminal almost 70 years ago. That's about 3.5 generations ago. Now, much has been said about Jesus in the interim, but not much has been written about him. Besides, you probably can't read anyway. The Romans have been making your life a misery, and you like what little you've heard about Jesus. You've joined the struggle, and you're part of the resistance of the domination which is enforced by empire. It isn't easy to risk your life, but you can't see any other way to resist than to throw your lot in with the followers of Jesus' way of being in the world. To keep your strength up, you get together, a crime in and of itself, because you are radical, subversive terrorists, according to the state. But you get together with the members of the resistance to participate in a subversive, nonviolent act against Rome. Now, Rome dominated and kept its citizens in line by any means possible. But those means didn't just include tyranny, brutality, terrorism, and executing those who disagreed with them. It also included civic events designed to mold citizens into acquiescence. And one of these civic events was the Roman banquet. Now, Roman banquets were designed to do more than feed the body. They followed a formula which enforced a kind of patronage together with a strict hierarchy. They would begin with a meal at which only those who were invited could attend. You weren't allowed to eat meals with people of a lesser category in society than you. So only certain people could attend these meals, and you were seated according to your rank, to your place in the empire. Slaves and women had no place around the table. The meal lasted about 90 minutes. We know this because lots of Romans have written about it. It's patterned after a Greco meal in earlier centuries. The meal lasts for about 90 minutes, and then it's followed by this transition piece, which is called the libation. Wine is poured, words are said, the wine is lifted to toast the gods and to toast Caesar, who is, of course, for the Romans, God. Caesar is God. The toasting was followed, get this, by a 3-hour symposium. Now, the symposium included storytelling, mostly about the triumphs of Rome. There'd be entertainment, dancing, music, sport, wrestling, magic, and jokes. All designed to uphold the values of Rome and solidify one's place in the empire. Now, follow me to the home of a prominent follower of the way, where we are getting together to encourage one another to resist the forces of empire. We're going to take the Roman banquet and we're going to turn it upside down. First of all, we shall eat our fill. Remember, food insecurity was rampant at this time, and people were starving. We are going to pool our resources, and everyone, regardless of class or wealth or gender, is going to eat their fill. Forget about whether you are slave or free, Jew or Gentile, man or woman. You have a place at the table. We are all equal at this meal. Oh, and there will be a libation. Wine will be poured. But you don't have to worry about toasting Caesar. We will raise our glasses and we will declare that Jesus and not Caesar is God. And yes, there will be a symposium. Stories will be told. We will sing songs of protest. We will hear from our wisdom keepers, and we will dream together, strategize together, and we will be nourished for the struggle which lies before us. Now, move out of your historical imagination and come with me into your prophetic imagination, the place where we dream dreams about what can be. Imagine, if you will, a banquet in which we gather to resist the forces of empire, all the empires in which we are hopelessly entwined. A banquet where everyone is equal, everyone has a place at the table. A banquet where the hungry are fed with good food. Yes, there will be a libation. We will raise our glasses to proclaim that love is our God. We will drink a toast to justice as the way to peace. We will declare that the earth is our home and not our property. We will toast justice seekers and peacemakers and not power brokers or warriors. We will declare that generosity and not greed is our way of being in the world. We will toast all that makes us one. And then, after the libation is done, the symposium will begin. Stories will be told of resisting our lesser angels. Songs of protest will be sung. Our wisdom keepers will reveal truth as they teach us to reverence creation, care for the earth, and feed everyone who hungers. There will be music, there will be dancing, there will be art and beauty and wonder. We shall all taste and see that the mystery in which we live and move and have our being is good. Suddenly, my desire to resist is creating hunger pains, and once again, I need to taste and see. I hope that as we continue to follow Jesus' way of being in the world, we can once again learn to taste and see in new ways, in ways that nourish us for the struggle of resistance. For life is so very good. And I pray that our feasting together will nourish us in our struggle to resist, so that all may know the love which is divinity, and that that love lives in, with, through, and beyond us, now and always. Amen.